the world, and women are disproportionately bearing the impact. We see intersecting inequalities based on gender, sexual orientation, as well as age and race and other dimensions being deepened. And so this is why the Global Alliance for Tax Justice, in collaboration with its regional networks in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, Europe, as well as North America, as well as other partners and members of the Global Tax and Gender Working Group, are taking part in this campaign, which we have dubbed the annual Global Days of Action for Tax Justice for Women's Rights, taking place from today to the 25th of March. And the banner, Make Taxes Work for Women. And so, as you may have realized, the campaign coincides with the 66th session of the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women, because this is a very key strategic advocacy opportunity for us, and it provides us a space to engage and dialogue with policymakers, particularly on tax issues affecting women. And this is in line with us being able to influence the negotiations process of the agreed conclusions of the CSW, the Commission on the Status of Women. And so even as you look at the priority theme for the CSW, which is achieving gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls in the context of climate change, environmental and disaster risk reduction policies and programs, it is quite timely for us to really look at the previous Global Days of Action editions, which have been very groundbreaking in mobilizing the tax justice movement on one hand and the women's rights movement on the other hand, to be able to work together to really highlight the urgency of making taxes to work for women, because they are really the ones who have been hardest hit by the pandemic triggered crisis, as well as the discriminatory tax laws and the runaway illicit financial flows. And so we are highlighting this fundamental issue through coordinated actions that show our collective power in addressing the tax issues that really affect women, and really having tax justice as part of the broader struggles for gender equality and women's rights, and also in the context of climate justice. And so how are we doing this? We are, of course, partnering with women's rights organizations and others within the social struggles to be able to show global solidarity and to be able to fight for a progressive tax and economic system that works for all women to overcome the current crisis. But also, it's an opportunity for us to better understand the linkages between climate, gender, tax justice, as well as care, and really highlighting the need to repair our care for the planet. And this is in line, of course, with the CSW priority theme that I've talked about. And we are also using this opportunity to really carry out coordinated actions to influence policymakers at all levels, from the national level, the global level. And we are seeing the regional networks of the Global Alliance carrying out different actions in different corners of the world. And lastly, but not least, of course, the need for us to continually call on states to really carry out their mandate to stop tax abuses and illicit financial flows. And we are doing this by setting forth 5 key demands. And one of these key demands include that tax and fiscal policies need to be in line with the 5R framework, which is that tax and fiscal policies need to recognize, to reduce, to redistribute, to reclaim, and to reward care work. Number 2 is that for the campaign period, our other message is that there's need for governments to reduce unfair tax burdens on women and to adopt progressive and redistributive gender equal taxation. Number 3 message is that there's need to remove gender bias and discrimination in tax policies and to ensure that tax revenues are raised and spent in ways that promote gender equality. And number 4 message is that there's need to ensure adequate financing of gender-responsive social services, public services that promote women's rights and reduce inequalities. And lastly, and of course not the least, to establish an inclusive intergovernmental global tax body. I know my colleague Tove will also speak to this and some of the progress that have happened in the recent past in regard to this. So with that, I would really want to welcome all of us to really join this conversation and be part of the discussion to really changing the narrative and to make taxes work for women on all fronts. Thank you, Nana. I hand it back to you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Caroline. This is incredibly important work that you're doing and a very pivotal time to do it. So it's wonderful that we all here to learn more about how we all can get involved. Now, we are incredibly honored to have with us Professor Ghosh, as I had mentioned. She is a professor at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and has received several prizes over the years, including for distinguished contributions to the social sciences in India in 2015, the International Labor Organization's Decent Work Research Prize for 2010, and the Nordsud Prize for Social Sciences in 2010 in Italy. She has advised governments in India and other countries, and she is the Executive Secretary of International Development Economics Associates, which is an international network of heterodox development economists. Professor Ghosh has consulted for international organizations, including the International Labor Organization, the United Nations Development Program, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs, and UN Women. And she is also a member of several international commissions, including the International Commission for the Reform of International Corporate Taxation and the Commission for Global Economic Transformation of the Institute for New Economic Thinking. So with that, we are so incredibly lucky to have you here with us, Professor Ghosh, and the floor is now yours.
Thank you so much. I am so delighted to be here. This is an incredible lineup of really impressive speakers you have. And so I'm really excited to hear all these discussions. I'm also really happy to see that it's at the forefront now. It's being recognized that tax justice is a gender issue and gender justice is also a tax issue. I think that interlinkage is so important for people to realize, and it's terrific that this is actually something that is going to bring these strands together in a very important way. I know from your lineup that you're going to get absolutely fabulous insights about different things that can be done at the national level. So I'm going to focus a little bit more on the international level, because I think that's absolutely crucial and it's urgent. In fact, I'm going to actually request you, if I may, to add, Carolyn, to your list of demands. I'm actually saying that there are some urgent global demands that we as feminists, as those believing in tax justice, need to take on immediately and campaign against or around, and that we can't even afford to make them general statements. We have to be very specific in these demands. I really hope that this conference, this getting together, is a way of actually bringing that particular need for mobilization out in the forefront as well. So let me explain what I mean. I think Carolyn already explained it very beautifully about how there's this massive failure of a global tax system that is broken, because it is allowing very, very rich individuals, the high net worth individuals, to stash their money all over the world in different parts where they do not pay the minimum even income taxes that they would have to pay, or that, let's say, their secretaries are paying back home in any normal way. But also multinational corporations pay a fraction of the tax that local companies pay, because they can use the existing tax system that was developed a century ago for a completely different world. They can use that existing tax system to be completely legal in avoiding taxes. And how does that work? It works through a phenomenon called base erosion and profit shifting. What does that mean? It means that because this company has got offices in many different countries, it can choose where it claims its profits are made. In other words, it can shift its profits from different countries to the places with the lowest taxes, to the low tax jurisdictions, as they're called. And it can do that by overinflating expenditures, making a lot of payments for so-called intellectual property, royalties, technical fees, all of that kind of thing. It can do various things that will show that you have very few profits in a country where most of your sales are. And all your profits are concentrated in some small country where there are hardly any taxation requirements. And this is what multinational corporations are doing. The digital ones in particular, but not just them, everyone. They all have got these large tax planning offices, thousands of employees whose job is to actually figure out the ways of legally avoiding tax. As a result of which, the biggest multinational corporations in the world pay effective tax rates of something like 2%, 4%, 10%, because they can shift it around all over the world and manage to escape to what are tax havens, but legal tax havens, and avoid paying the taxes. Now, there is a way of dealing with this, and it's a fairly straightforward way. The commission that Nana mentioned, the Independent Commission for the Reform of International Corporate Taxation, we have been advocating now for several years that what you have to do is not treat all these companies as different companies in each country. It's not Apple France, Apple India, Apple Canada, Apple Nigeria. No, there's one Apple. And the shareholders of Apple know this. And Apple itself, the management of Apple knows this. So we should also treat Apple as one company. We should treat BP as one company. We should treat Shell as one company. We should treat Google as one company. What does that mean? It means every country taxes their share of the global profits according to a formula. We have suggested a formula where you take so much sales, so much employment, so much assets in that country. We can figure out the ratio. Let's say we do 60-20-20, 70-20-10. It doesn't really matter. You choose a ratio based on mostly sales, but also employment and assets. And you say, look, Google, your global profits are 15 billion. My share of that global profits would be, let's say, 1 billion. I'm going to tax you on that 1 billion at my country's tax rate. It's fairly easy to do. And it is being done, for example, in the United States. That's how the US states actually do taxation, because they all have independent taxing powers. So it's possible to do this. What's stopping it is the fact that we still treat all these companies as what is called arm's length. We treat them as separate companies, and that therefore they can get away with this profit shifting nonsense. But also we have been saying that to do that effectively, you need a global minimum tax rate. Because otherwise you will anyway get companies moving to the lower tax jurisdictions in whichever way they can, and shifting more activities as well to the lower tax jurisdiction. So let's at least put a global minimum. Let's prevent too much excessive of this profit shifting. Now, after many years and much struggle and years, more than 7 years of negotiations, the OECD finally agreed to this, okay? But so they accepted the principles. They accepted the principle that there has to be sharing of the global profits and a taxation of that by countries. And they accepted the principle of a global minimum tax. The trouble is that then, largely because of corporate lobbies, they watered it down to such an extent that it is almost meaningless. So, there are estimates that we are losing anywhere between 480 to more than $600 billion a year by multinationals shifting profits around in this way. But the way that the OECD proposal has watered this down, you cannot do this for all companies, only the top 100 companies. You can not tax all their profits. You can only tax all the profits that are above 10% for no particular reason. It's just randomly stated. And so you get down to about 10 billion. In other words, while the world is losing about 480 billion every year, you're down to only 10 billion of shareable, taxable, taxes on profits. That's ridiculous. And in any case, the lion's share of that would go to the rich countries, to the advanced economies, which are the homes of these multinationals. So developing countries get next to nothing. The global minimum tax, we had been advocating that it should be 25%. Why 25%? Because that's the median, that's the middle of all the global tax rates. Half of the countries in the world have tax rates that are higher than 25%. Most developing countries have tax rates of 30% or more. And so we said, put it in the middle, make that median the global minimum tax rate. Instead, it's 15%, which is so much lower. It is close to the rate of, in fact, tax havens like Ireland, which is 12.5%. So it's a really low bar. And imagine a country where your corporate tax rate is 34% or 30%. If the global minimum is 15%, that minimum can become a maximum. You can get arm twisted by multinationals who say, you're double the global minimum. And developing countries can be forced to bring down these rates, which would be exactly the opposite of what we need. So the principle was accepted, which is great. But then the principle was watered down and distorted to such an extent that it's not just meaningless, it will be counterproductive. Why? Because along with this, what are we being told? Everybody who signs on to this, who ratifies this agreement, will have to give up independent taxation of multinationals. You can't do a digital tax on companies that are doing digital transactions. You can't do any other independent taxation of these companies. And furthermore, you will have to be subject to investor-state dispute settlement, which is a really terrible thing, which always goes against the governments and pretty much heavily corporate biased. And all our experience with ISDS, investor-state dispute settlement, is that it is inevitably biased against the interests of states and citizens of the developing world. So why is this so urgent? Because this is what the OECD agreed. This is what G7 and then G20 agreed to. This is now what is being, the countries are being pressurized to accept this and ratify this in their domestic tax systems. Once we ratify this, that's it, we're stuck. It is written in stone for at least 3 decades. It will be really hard to change. We've got so much experience of this, whether it's Bretton Woods or WTO, you agree to something and it has got you by the neck for the next few decades. So we really must not ratify this. We are giving up the powers and we're giving up the capacity to have a proper deal with real justice that actually does what it's supposed to do rather than this pretend version. It's very important for everyone believing in tax justice, for all feminists to get together and oppose this and prevent this from actually being passed. So please mobilize to stop your governments from ratifying this. Mobilize at the regional level to get regional arrangements to say, no, we demand a renegotiation. Mobilize in G20, mobilize in every possible forum to stop this from becoming something that is written in stone. That's absolutely urgent. I would say, please add this to your demands, make it #1 demand. In addition, this final point, I'm sorry I'm going on so long, but I want to add one more international point, which is very important. And this is something which has come out so clearly in the last 1 month when sanctions against Russia were imposed. And suddenly everyone discovered that there's a lot of money of Russian oligarchs held all over the world, and you can find it if you want. Now, oligarchs don't only come from Russia. We have got plutocrats, kleptocrats across the world, especially developing countries, stashing their money abroad. And they are enabled by Western financial institutions. We must demand national asset registers, which then get transformed into global knowledge. Everybody should know where people are stashing away their wealth. And this can enable you to go after them. Right now, we don't have that information, and developing countries in particular do not have the information about where rich individuals, corrupt leaders are stashing their wealth across the world. But they are mostly things that are enabled by northern financial institutions. Private banks, private hedge funds, private asset managers are doing all the dirty work. We should demand public knowledge of that. And we now know that it's quite easy. If you really want to get after a particular set of oligarchs, you can. Why don't we demand this treatment for all oligarchs? Because it's all unfair gains that are being transported. And these are tax evasion. These are not just tax avoidance. So this gives us an opportunity, once again, to demand in all our countries a national asset register, and then to make that globally available so that we actually have a global asset register. Again, this is an urgent demand because we now know that it can be done quite easily. If we can do these things, we're told anytime we want anything, we want more investment in care, we want more investment in greening the economy, we want more employment decent work for women, etc. We're told, oh, where's the money? The government's budget cannot stand it. We don't have the fiscal space. That's what we're told all the time. Here are things that will give us fiscal space. We have to demand this, and we have to say we will not accept a bad deal. We demand a deal that gives justice. We demand a deal that delivers gender justice as well. So I've talked too much already, but thank you so much for allowing me to be part of this.
Thank you so much, Professor Ghosh, for that extremely powerful review. I mean, of base erosion and profit shifting and the need to treat multinationals as one company from a tax equity lens and how that can be done, and also the tax information gap and how that is impacting developing countries. I really loved your initial comment that tax justice is a gender issue and gender justice is a tax issue, and we absolutely have the global tools that we need to address all of that. So as you had mentioned,
I just want to make one more point, which I forgot to say. No, it's not a point really. It's just my colleague Nancy Folgray has this wonderful phrase: "Necessity is the mother of coalitions." So I think it's really important. It's great that these two movements are getting together, and now we have to build coalitions as widely as possible for these demands as well.
Absolutely. And I think we are at the right time and right space to be doing that. So again, we thank you so much for your excellent remarks. And now we're going to move on to the roundtable. We have 6 experts from around the world, and I'm going to briefly introduce each one. So first up, we have Caroline Othim. As I had previously mentioned, she's the Policy Advocacy and Campaigns Coordinator at the Global Alliance for Tax Justice. Caroline is a Pan-African feminist economist, a lawyer, and a gender specialist. She is the thematic lead on tax and gender at GATJ, and she is passionate about tax and gender justice and works in policy and advocacy spaces to ensure that tax justice is a lived reality for everyone, particularly for women and for girls everywhere. So Caroline, we very much look forward to hearing your remarks. Next, we have Chenai Mukumba, and she is the Policy Research and Advocacy Manager at the Tax Justice Network Africa. Chenai is responsible for leading the policy unit and coordinating the institution's research and policy engagement at regional and global levels. She also oversees the institution's technical backstopping of TJNA's national level advocacy. And most recently, she was elected to sit on the board of the African Tax Administration Forum's African Tax and Women Network as the vice chair. So Chenai, we are very delighted to have you with us today. We also have Ian Gary, and Ian is a senior policy research and advocacy professional with over 25 years of experience in fiscal transparency and accountability, international development, and the reform of natural resource governance. Prior to joining the FACT Coalition, where he currently sits as executive director, Ian directed Oxfam America's global policy, advocacy, and program work focused on promoting transparent and accountable financial flows, for example, from oil and mining revenues and taxes and aid to fight poverty. He led a team of policy managers, advisors, and researchers, and is based in Washington, DC. And prior to joining Oxfam, Ian was Strategic Issues Advisor for Africa and Strategic Issues Advisor for the extractive industries at the Catholic Relief Services from 1999 to 2005. He has also held positions with the Ford Foundation, as well as international development organizations in the US and in Africa. So Ian, we are extremely excited to have you here today and to draw on your broad bench of expertise. We are also happy to have Jeannie Manipon, who is the Senior Program Manager for Development Finance of the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development. And she's also co-convener of the Tax and Gender Working Group of the Tax and Fiscal Justice Network Asia. She has over 20 years of experience in advocacy, research, and campaigning on a wide range of issues, including human rights, gender equality, economic justice, peace and security, biodiversity, conservation, and also sustainable development. Prior to joining the APMDD, she worked for international organizations, including UN Women and the Initiatives for International Dialogue, which is an international NGO that fosters people-to-people dialogue and solidarity. In various capacities, Jeannie has provided technical advice to international development organizations and government agencies, especially on gender and development. She's also taught courses on international politics and development studies as a senior lecturer at Miriam College in the Philippines. And throughout all of these involvements, Jeannie considers herself a social activist, drawing on the rich resources of feminism and other lenses for critical analysis and participation in civil society and social movement initiatives. So Jeannie, we are really, really grateful to have you with us today and to hear about the very rich perspective that you bring to tax and gender justice. We are also joined by Tove Maria Ryding, and Tove is tax coordinator at Eurodad and now leads the organization's work on tax and transparency. And she carries out coordination, advocacy, and communications work, as well as research and analysis. Tove is one of 2 elected representatives for Tax Justice Europe in the coordinating committee of the GATJ. And before joining Eurodad, she worked with Greenpeace International as coordinator for climate policy. She's also been chair of the Danish 92 group for over 5 years and head of the Danish NGO Force of the World for 3 years. So Tove, it is wonderful to see you here. Thank you for being with us as well, and very much look forward to hearing your remarks. And last but not least, we have Verónica Serafini, who is an economist with Latina. She's an economist with a master's degree in social sciences from Flaxo, Mexico, and a doctorate in economics from UNAM, Mexico. Both of her theses centered on development and gender policies. She was a consultant for the United Nations system, the International Development Bank, and the World Bank. So Verónica, we are also very thrilled to have you and your expertise here with us today. Thank you so much for your time. So to all of our panelists, we again are very lucky to have your expertise. And I'm going to ask each person one question at a time. And I just ask that you keep your replies to a couple of minutes. So with that, I'm going to kick off our roundtable with a question for Chenai. And that question is that countries, particularly from the global south, continue to lose by some estimates billions of dollars annually due to tax abuse and illicit financial flows under the current international finance system. So how does this affect women's rights and gender equality, particularly in Africa and in other global south regions? And what can be done to help alleviate this problem?
Thanks so much, Nana. I'm so honored to be able to sit on this panel. I mean, I was just listening to the summary CVs of all of the panelists here, and it really is such an honor to be, able to contribute to this conversation. So thank you so much for your question. I think part of it, Jayati already spoke to. I mean, I think as a keynote address, that was really incredible. And a lot of what I'm going to say is really just going to build off from what she just said. And I'm going to try and put it all within 5 minutes. So I think the issue of illicit financial flows is really, foremost. And I think particularly now, given the situation that so many countries, particularly in the global south, find themselves, right, where they're struggling to invest into their economy to build back better, but, don't have the resources to do so for a number of different reasons, sort of the slowdown of economic growth that we saw, but also I think particularly for African countries, this issue of having to sort of pay back these debt repayments that are currently on their books. But the issue of illicit financial flows is particularly pertinent because what it is countries losing the resources that they could be using to invest into their countries. So, I mean, at a global level, about 40% of multinational corporation profits are shifted from companies towards, from countries to tax havens and low tax jurisdictions. And this at a global level amounts to about $900 billion. The amount of money leaving the African continent is really about $90 billion. And research has already shown that the amount of money that we're losing as a continent exceeds how much we receive in overseas development assistance, as well as even FDI, right? So that just kind of puts into perspective the amount of money that we're losing vis-a-vis how much we receive. Now, what that does, when we're seeing money flow out of our countries, particularly in the global south, it limits countries' ability to use their own domestic resources as a tool for development. It limits their ability to use tax as a tool for development. And particularly pertaining to this conversation, it limits countries' ability to be able to use tax, to be able to use their own resources to promote gender equality. And when countries have the resources, right, when they're not grappling to find resources to invest into their economies, you know, we can see them do two things to address gender equality. The first is be able to engage in sort of gender responsive budgeting, right? The ability to have these resources when countries have them allows countries to be able to invest in health, in education, in social protection, all key sectors that are imperative, particularly for women to have access to, given their own limited access to labor markets. So that's the first thing that, you know, illicit financial flows takes away from countries. But the second thing as well is that when you're seeing illicit financial flows play out, is that it also takes away governments' abilities to adopt gender-based taxation systems, which can mitigate the adverse impacts of market failures, right, that are either explicitly or implicitly discriminating against women, right? So for example, in many countries, in many African countries, women have very limited access to labor markets, or they tend to be very overrepresented at the bottom of this sort of distribution curve, right? These labor supply behavior issues really can be addressed through the implementation of sort of gender-based taxation. But when our countries are losing money through illicit financial flows, it really takes away from the various tools that governments have to be able to use taxation to address these issues. So when governments have the resources and are able to use taxation to address gender equality, what we've been able to see, what research has been able to show, is that we then see an increased number of women being able to engage in the labor force, and thereby addressing gender equality, gender inequality, particularly income inequality that we see arising particularly from unpaid domestic care work. And this is particularly important because I was listening to Caroline earlier as well, and addressing this issue of unpaid care work is particularly pertinent and very, very important, especially when we're trying to address this issue of gender equality. And so, you know, when governments have resources, when governments essentially are able to maximize their own domestic resources, they're able to then implement progressive taxation policies. And really what this means is that a policy whereby those who earn the most are paying the most. And when you're able to, for example, implement a progressive income tax system, you're able to then address this issue of gender equality, whereby, for example, women that tend to earn less are being taxed less, thereby incentivizing their participation within the labor market, right? And this is one way you can then get women to be much more active within the market, much more able to gain resources, and thereby address this particular income gap. So what I'm trying to speak to is how this issue of illicit financial flows has very direct implications on gender equality vis-a-vis women's access to the labor market, right? And then also addressing this issue of various discrepancies that exist between men and women, and really pinpointing to why it's so necessary for us to be addressing this issue of illicit financial flows. And so to address your second question, Nana, like what can we do, right? I think Jayati spoke to so many of these issues, and so for fear of repeating her, I'm just going to double click on a lot of the points that she made earlier. Illicit financial flows are a global problem. This is not a problem that we can deal with at national level, not even at continental level. now, the amount of money that's leaving the continent comparatively to how much is being shifted globally, when I'm talking about the African context, is a lot less, but the implications on people's lives, and particularly women's day-to-day lives, are much, much more severe. So when we are talking, for example, about this conversation about the global minimum tax rate, I completely agree with Jayati. It most absolutely is an urgent issue that I know a lot of us have currently been tackling and addressing. And I know when I was listening to Caroline, she sort of spoke to the 5 key issues that GATJ works on. And I know particularly the issue of pushing for a global tax body is one that speaks directly to this issue, because absolutely we've seen the OECD pick up this conversation, having seen the necessity for us to have a global minimum tax rate, but primarily because of the lack of inclusivity within that space. Almost 50% of African countries are not represented within that forum. A number of global South countries have actually come out to speak against the outcomes of that space. I think what's particularly important is to see that conversation shift to a multilateral space. And I know institutions, us including a number of other regional partners within GATJ, are doing a lot of national level work to see to it that these conversations are being had at national level, and they can then be escalated to the global level, so that we can start to see global South participants meaningfully contributing to these conversations, in the hope that we then see outcomes that are in the best interest of global South countries. Jayati mentioned that 25% is really more fair comparatively, given its median nature as a corporate income tax rate. Having had a space where we had equal spaces for global South countries, that may have been something that we would have seen. At national level, I think there's a lot of other things that countries can be taking to address this issue of illicit financial flows. First and foremost, addressing this issue of beneficial ownership, right? The establishment of national registries, so that we're able to see who the true owners of companies are, so that we're able to see who is the person who is benefiting the most from multinational, well, from economic activity is particularly pertinent. And the establishment of national asset registries, then contributing to a global asset registry, is absolutely something that would see us address this issue of illicit financial flows. And then I think another thing amongst the whole host of different actions that countries could be taking to address this issue of illicit financial flows, one of the things that we've seen particularly on the African continent is an increase in tax incentives by a number of different countries that are trying to attract foreign direct investment. Understandably so, many African countries are finding themselves in a situation where they're really looking for resources, and as such trying to do all they can. And so the extent to which countries are able to cooperate regionally to address this issue of tax incentives is something that we've been working quite a lot on, and really sort of speaking to what can be done regionally, right, to contribute to this global conversation about a minimum tax rate that I was mentioning earlier. So I think in a nutshell, Nana, I'm going to be wrapping up now, that the issue of illicit financial flows absolutely is so important, because unaddressed has most negative impacts, particularly on women, particularly on marginalized communities. But the different steps that we can take to address it can be done at national level, and to reiterate what Jayati does at global level now, really to sort of see consolidated efforts to addressing this issue. Thanks so much, Nana.
Chenai, thank you so much for your remarks. I mean, $90 billion is a staggering and very disheartening number. And I really appreciate you highlighting the implications of that loss, but also what governments can do when they have the proper resources and can engage in gender responsive budgeting, as you had mentioned. So it's great to see that there is, regional mobilization through organizations such as yours, and look forward to seeing how that work will progress. Now, along those lines, my next question is for Jeannie. And Jeannie, I would love to know, broadly speaking, how do feminist principles anchor feminist economics?
Thank you, Nana. Is that how you pronounce it? Okay. Yeah, thank you for that question. I was very inspired by the speakers so far, Carol, Jayati, and Chenai. Well, Perhaps one way of looking at it is a simple way of looking at feminist economists or feminist economics. I'm not an economist, but I am a feminist. It does ask, how do women participate? It does interrogate and ask, how do women participate in the economy? How do they benefit from the economy? And how do women and men participate in and benefit from in different ways? How are resources distributed across different gender and social groups? At bottom line, does the economy work for all women? As I understand it, feminist economics has a much more comprehensive look at the economy. That this has to do with a wide range of processes, not just what has been traditionally taught us, in terms of what economic studies or measures or what constitutes economic production or work that has economic value. In fact, we're taught that the origin of course, Jayati and Verónica should, I would love to learn from them. We're taught that the origin of the word economics is from a Greek word that has to do with management of the household and how resources are used, managed, distributed. But somewhere along the way, in the long history, the household there sort of disappeared, and the women that inhabit the household got pushed to the margins. And the study of economics as we came to know it now has less to do with the household per se. But if feminist economics looks at productive and the productive and reproductive spheres, and which has to do with everything that the society needs to reproduce itself socially and otherwise, biologically. So care and care work, how it is done, how it is valued, and who does it, is thus a very central theme in feminist economics. Chenai already emphasized this issue of unpaid care work. It looks at how care work is valued or not valued, how it is distributed and organized, not just in the household, but in larger economic units and globally. Unpaid care work is an important area of study, but also for feminist advocacy. When we think of how much women's care work is unpaid because it's considered natural for women to cook and clean and care for the family anyway. But we need to think how this unpaid work contributes to the household economy, but also how it contributes to the global economy, to the accumulation of wealth in large scale. We see the gender division of labor in care work, unpaid but also paid, with women taking on the larger share. But we also see what sometimes we refer to as an international and transnational division of labor, where women's labor from the global south is mobilized to meet as cheap labor to meet care needs in the global north. Now, so feminist economics also looks at how in these processes, economic and social power are distributed unequally, and we look at how power relations are very much gendered and the different intersecting layers of inequalities in those processes. Who has economic power? Who has the ability to produce, to buy, to dispense resources, to make economic decisions? I believe all these are part of a feminist economic agenda that we also need to look at if we want to advocate for a transformative agenda. Relating it to tax systems, of course, systems, policies, as well as practices. A very simple question could be, how do women participate in and benefit from taxation? What's collected from women? And what is spent for women's needs and rights? Chenai already mentioned gender responsive budgeting. So that is one issue also that we want to look at. But how do tax policies impact on women, shape their lives, and in what ways are these empowering or disempowering for women? Take the example of indirect or consumption taxes that are set at fixed rate. These are very burdensome for women and other marginalized groups. When tax systems are dependent on indirect taxation because they let corporations get away with profit shifting and tax abuses, or when tax systems are dependent on collecting consumption taxes like the VAT that are levied on basic household goods, that really hits women hard. Women spend a bigger share of their income which is already lower than men in general due to gender pay gaps. Women tend to spend a bigger share of their income for basic household goods, whether in times of, in normal times, during the pandemic times, in times of climate-induced disasters. Another question to ask is when a state's capacity to raise and mobilize revenues, as Chenai already said, to spend for public services, how are women's lives affected? When economies are drained of potential revenues due to tax abuses by corporations and elite individuals, what would this mean for women's lives? So those are questions that feminist economics should ask. Of course, an important question to pose is also said already by previous speaker, is how we can harness the potential of taxation to address inequalities, to reduce inequalities, to redistribute power and resources. This is really about harnessing taxation for a transformative agenda and for redistributive justice. What kinds of policies should be put in place? We really want to do this, not to harness tax for redistributive justice, but also we want to, going back to Jayati's point earlier, stop tax deals and initiatives that serve to reinforce inequalities within and among countries. That is also a central feminist agenda. And I really thank Jayati for putting that up front. The women of APMDD and the Tax and Fiscal Justice Asia have been campaigning this very strongly these past several months, and some of the key demands that have resonated among our organizations. One, of course, tax the rich, not the poor. In a nutshell, that this demand really expresses our demand for progressive and redistributive justice. Women living in poverty is a very strong constituency for tax justice campaigning. We campaign to adopt policies like wealth tax. Women workers groups are saying tax the billionaire, not the worker. We campaign to fairly tax income and wealth of corporations and to end unfair taxes that are burdensome on women and marginalized groups. We also campaign continuously to end tax abuses of corporations and the elite. And number one in the Pandora Papers expose last year, political and business elite, especially those with connections to the extractive industry. This is something we are very seriously looking at, that we need sustained campaigning for that. Next week, we will hold a webinar looking at the situation of women in mining affected communities and their demands for economic justice, including tax justice. We campaign continuously to stop illicit financial flows that are plugging and the need to plug the leaks in the economy. IFFs really drain our economies, robbing us of potential revenues for public services. Finally, another very increasingly popular demand, and I think we need to continue among tax justice activists, but we need to really bring this up again in the coming months, to reject tax deals and initiatives that we believe will really reinforce inequalities in the global system and really will impact on the lives of women and marginalized sectors. So that I will begin with that. Thank you, Nana, for this chance to speak.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jeannie, for that very robust description of feminist economics as a much more holistic way of looking at the economy. I mean, I think that's very much needed now as we try and transition out of the pandemic and think about what we want the world to look like. And I think you also raised some really great questions regarding what kinds of taxes are collected from women and how do they impact their lives, like VAT or other consumption taxes. So I think that segues perfectly actually into the next question, which is for Verónica. And Verónica, my question for you is, how does substantive gender equality factor into a fair and progressive tax system? How can gender equality be realized through tax and fiscal policy?
Gracias, Nana. I am talking in Spanish. Gracias, Nana, por esa importante pregunta, porque efectivamente desde América Latina estamos muy preocupados por uno de los problemas más graves que tiene nuestro sistema tributario, que es el de la regresividad de nuestros sistemas. Recaudamos poco en muchos países, hay otros países que están al nivel a un promedio más alto, pero en general todos los países de América Latina recaudan poco y mal en términos de la regresividad del sistema tributario. Y en esa regresividad puedo rescatar mucho de lo que se dijo antes. En primer lugar, porque tenemos tasas nominales muy bajas en los impuestos directos. Eso hace que al final, si queremos tener recaudaciones tributarias, se sostienen en los impuestos indirectos como el IVA. Y esas tasas nominales, además de las tasas nominales bajas de los impuestos a la riqueza, el impuesto al patrimonio, de hecho no tenemos en muchos países impuesto a la riqueza, apenas impuesto a la renta, tenemos flujos financieros ilícitos que también erosionan la base tributaria. Esa base tributaria recauda menos impuestos por los flujos ilícitos, pero esos flujos ilícitos también se convierten en una necesidad de recuperar esos capitales a partir de incentivos tributarios. Y esos incentivos tributarios benefician a la inversión extranjera directa, que también llega y se sostiene con beneficios desde las mujeres porque pagan ingresos menores y son trabajos precarios, muchas veces sin seguridad social, sin protección social. Entonces ahí hay un vínculo en la política fiscal, por eso desde la economía feminista es muy importante ver los tres pilares de manera conjunta. Por un lado, lo que decíamos, la falta de recursos, pero por otro lado también el sistema tributario, que es el otro pilar de la política fiscal, y que también en este momento estamos con alto riesgo por la deuda. América Latina había salido de los procesos de deuda, pero empezó a endeudarse antes de la pandemia, eso se profundizó, y eso va a generar necesidad de más recursos tributarios que hoy provienen de impuestos indirectos. Y ahí surge otro problema. En este contexto de sistemas tributarios regresivos, ¿quién va a pagar la deuda? Y lo van a pagar, vamos a tener que pagarlo con impuestos indirectos que recaen sobre todo en las mujeres, en un continente donde hay una sobrerepresentación de mujeres en los hogares pobres. Por cada 100 hombres en hogares pobres hay 114 mujeres en estos hogares. Y son sobre quienes peor recae los impuestos indirectos. Y en este sentido es que tenemos que abordar desde la economía feminista una mirada mucho más compleja. Necesitamos evaluar con enfoque de género la inversión extranjera directa, además de evaluar obviamente los sistemas tributarios. En general necesitamos evaluar con enfoque de género el gasto tributario, todos estos incentivos, ¿nos sirven o no nos sirven? Proponer impuestos directos, obviamente. Necesitamos evaluar también la inversión extranjera directa, ¿le benefician o no a las mujeres? Y en este ámbito es que, bueno, se nos muestra todo un panorama, un gran desafío para contrarrestar estos sistemas tributarios injustos, tanto por el lado de los ingresos, porque necesitamos financiar políticas, como aquí ya se dijo, políticas de cuidado, políticas económicas, y que ese financiamiento no recaiga de nuevo en las poblaciones más pobres. Hoy en América Latina financiamos políticas de protección social con impuestos indirectos. Eso significa básicamente que le estamos sacando a la clase media y a las personas en situación de pobreza recursos para que vuelvan a esa misma, nosotros mismos, la misma población en América Latina financia sus propias políticas, porque quienes deberían pagar para hacer un sistema más redistributivo, para tener una economía más justa y más redistributiva, hoy en proporción con sus ingresos pagan menos. Creo que tenemos en la región un gran desafío, no solamente en el análisis de estos temas en particular, sino también el gran desafío de ver cómo el sistema económico y el modelo económico latinoamericano es injusto, porque todos estos temas se vinculan. Yo creo que todas las compañeras que me antecedieron dieron luz a estos temas, y bueno, desde la economía feminista nos estamos cuestionando, le estamos cuestionando a la política pública, a la política fiscal en particular, estos temas, y necesitamos hacer un esfuerzo por incorporar esto a la política económica, porque la política social ha sido mucho más permeable a las preocupaciones en torno a la desigualdad de género, no así a la política económica. Por eso hoy tenemos tantos desafíos pendientes en materia de información sobre sistemas tributarios con enfoque de género, información sobre los flujos financieros ilícitos con enfoque de género. Nuestros flujos financieros ilícitos son de amplio espectro, vienen de la minería, de la soja, del narcotráfico, de muchos ámbitos, y bueno, sabemos que también están vinculados a los paraísos, a los paraísos tributarios, que también es una, como dijo Jayati, ahora en este momento de la pandemia y de lo que está pasando con la guerra con Rusia, nos han aflorado todos estos problemas, y bueno, creo que es el momento de ponerlo sobre la mesa, de discutir las categorías analíticas tradicionales de la economía, y poner en cuestión y exigir también, no solamente a nosotros mismos, sino también a la academia y a los organismos internacionales, que miren desde la economía feminista todos estos temas, porque los movimientos sociales en América Latina creo que están conociendo estos temas, sienten estos temas, y tenemos una proyección futura para las mujeres sumamente negativa. La pandemia nos retrocedió casi 10 años en lo que avanzamos en los últimos 15 años atrás. Tenemos grandes pérdidas, y hoy tenemos además el riesgo de la deuda. Y eso implica poder revisar todo nuestro andamiaje teórico, y sobre todo ver una política fiscal, apostar por una política fiscal feminista en los tres ámbitos: por el lado del gasto, por el lado del sistema tributario, y también por el lado de la deuda o del financiamiento.
Okay. Verónica, thank you so much for that overview and description of what is at stake in Latin America with regards to the debt burden, and also the fact that women very likely could bear the burden of paying off that debt based on the current emphasis on indirect taxes. I know that there's been a lot of discussion about wealth taxation in Latin America, and so definitely the region will be one to watch in that aspect. So now I want to look at this from a more global perspective, and accordingly, the next question is for Tove. So Tove, my question for you is, how have institutions of global governance continued to undermine women's rights and progress towards achieving fair and progressive tax systems? Could you also describe some recent developments in the international tax governance space and their implications for gender equality?
Yeah, thank you so much, Nana. And also warm thanks to the Global Alliance for Tax Justice for this fantastic initiative that we have every year to make sure that we campaign to put tax and gender on the agenda. And thank you for bringing together this fantastic panel. It's an honor to come after such great speakers. And how have the global institutions that are in charge, how have they undermined these efforts? Well, first of all, they fail to solve the problems. And if we look at the institution that has led on global tax policies for the last 50 years, the OECD, as Jayati Ghosh mentioned, they haven't solved these issues, and it's been over 5 decades. This is the institution from which we got the transfer pricing system. And so there is a huge problem in having global institutions making decisions that don't solve these issues. Of course, in relation to, and thank you, Nana, for mentioning debt, a very dear topic to Eurodad as well. And we see again and again a concerning role of, for example, the IMF when countries are heavily indebted. We see these global institutions not only fail to move forward the agenda of progressive taxes, but actually be there and promote the use of regressive taxes to repay debts. And of course, as we know and as we've heard, regressive taxes have disproportionately hard impacts on women. So there's a lot of things that have gone wrong. But in terms of important initiatives, one very, very important thing that's happening is that there is a growing call, not just for having an intergovernmental tax body under the United Nations, but also for having a UN tax convention. And this was a proposal that first came from the Africa group in the United Nations. They put it forward in 2019. And then the year after, it was actually included on a menu of options in the United Nations for what governments could do to tackle the COVID-19 crisis. It was also a key recommendation from the so-called FACTI high-level panel that gave their report last year. So what we have done now is we basically sat down and wrote a proposal for what a UN tax convention could look like. And first of all, the UN tax convention would introduce a forum where governments negotiate as equals. It doesn't matter whether you are Malawi or whether you are the United States, you negotiate as equals. And this is normal in the United Nations. It's not normal in the world of tax. In fact, we have huge inequality in terms of how much countries are able to be present and how much power they have in the different institutions. So that's the first thing that the UN tax convention would do. And we should say we sent this proposal out last week, so it's online now. There were also some of the ideas that came up. Jayati Ghosh mentioned the need to have a new way of taxing multinational corporations as one company with a minimum effective corporate tax rate, and to transform fully instead of this solution that the OECD has come up with, where you use that system for a few companies and a few profits, but generally you continue the transfer pricing system. In our proposal for a UN tax convention, it basically starts a negotiation to do a full transformation of the global tax system towards taxing multinational corporations as one company and based on and include a minimum effective corporate tax rate. So that's Article 11 in our suggested convention. In Article 19, you have the Global Asset Registry that Jayati Ghosh also mentioned. So again, the idea is to negotiate and establish a registry that shows who owns what. And this is extremely important for trying to get wealth taxes to function, for example. Chenai mentioned beneficial ownership registries showing who owns companies. That's Article 6 in the convention and so forth. So we basically included a lot of these proposals in the UN Tax Convention. But the most important thing about the UN Tax Convention is actually the idea of having a straightforward, solid framework for the decision-making on global tax issues, and to have one that links the tax governance directly to the international commitments that governments have taken on in terms of reducing inequalities. And to have a convention that has an objective that mentions progressive taxation and fairness. And to have also in that objective a link to the government commitment to mobilizing the funding to promote the global goals and objectives, including the sustainable development goals and environmental protection and equality and so forth. So one of the most important parts of the convention is really to have a clear objective that says this is what global tax governance is about, and progressive taxes is a core part of that. And as much as it's simple to write an objective like that, it's miles away from where we are on international tax governance, where we have so many different types of standards and conventions and a lot of different agreements. But we don't have this one framework, and we often don't have clear objectives with these agreements that we have today. The one clear objective that governments seem to pursue very much is to make sure there's no double taxation, that no company or individual is taxed twice on the same income. That's a good objective, but it cannot be the only objective when we do international tax governance. So that's a key part of the convention. And there's also, I want to mention Article 13 in the proposal, which introduces policy coherence and basically establishes a commitment on policy coherence. And that means that tax policies must be coherent with the other obligations that governments have. And that includes, of course, the commitments to pursue gender equality. So the idea in Article 13 is to make it clear that governments have a commitment to be coherent in their tax governance. And you can't have tax governance be separate from, for example, the obligations related to women's rights and gender equality. And secondly, it introduces an obligation to report, for governments to report on how are you doing on making sure that your tax policies are coherent. And there's a specific mention there on the fact that the reports should, of course, include how they are performing in relation to their gender equality commitments. And it's not just a domestic obligation, it's also about reporting whether a country's tax system is undermining the ability of other countries to fulfill their obligations. And that's where we have, of course, a strengthened effort to try and stop tax havens and destructive international tax competition, as tax havens like to call it. Lastly, the last thing I want to mention in terms of what the convention includes is that it includes a line saying that, of course, there should be full and effective participation of women in all levels of policymaking on tax. That would be very new in the world of tax, to have a clear decision on that. We don't have that in the international tax conventions and standards that we have at the moment. But it's not new in the United Nations. There are examples of other UN conventions where this is a normal thing and where this has already been included in a convention. So basically the idea is, let's take and learn from the many other UN conventions that we have, and let's do this for tax so that we get an international system that is much simpler than what we have at the moment, but also so that it's linked to all these other discussions that are taking place in the United Nations. And then the last key thing about moving the decision-making to the United Nations has also to do with transparency of the decision-making. We often get asked, do you follow the OECD negotiations on tax, and do you participate? And it doesn't take much time to follow the OECD negotiations as much as we're allowed to, because we're not allowed in the room. We're not even allowed to be in the building when they negotiate. There's no webcast. It's not transparent. Often the negotiating text is not public. It really doesn't take much time to follow the negotiations as much as you're allowed to, because it's so difficult and there's very, very low transparency. And for those of you who try to follow a UN negotiation, you'll see that it's often very different. There's observers in the room, and we can make statements. We can often see the negotiations live on the internet. Of course, the negotiation texts are public, and so forth. And the reason why this is very relevant to the discussion about gender equality is, of course, because still today we have a high dominance of men among decision makers. When it comes to the real power holders, we have a long way to go before we have gender equality, which means that when the decision makers, when the decisions become less transparent and the processes become very closed, and it's only the most powerful decision makers that get to be in the room when decisions are made, there you also get a huge gender equality. And unfortunately, often when women get in the room when it comes to tax negotiations, it's often a civil society and observers. And of course, we need to pursue a world where the most powerful decision makers are 50-50 men, women, and inclusive of all types of ethnic groups and diversities in all ways. We're not there yet. And as long as we still have huge inequality in decision making, at least we need to have transparent decision making so that everyone who's not included still has a chance to hold our decision makers to account. So this is the proposal on the table. I think it's hopefully hugely relevant to the discussion about gender equalities, but it should also be said that this is a discussion paper. This is an attempt to try and move the debate to talk about how we want to decide, how we want to design global tax governance going forward. Hopefully we will see a debate about how we can structure a fair and effective and transparent global tax governance, rather than only focusing on the latest thing that was decided and what we think about that, because then we'll always be running behind the bus. So this proposal was sent out under the initiative of both Eurodad and the Global Alliance for Tax Justice, and we sincerely hope that it can be a real conversation starter going forward. So thank you again for this great debate, and thank you to all the panelists for fantastic interventions.
Tove, thank you so much. I mean, the calls in this new proposal for UN Tax Convention for policy coherence and gender equality, as you had mentioned, and also for the full and effective participation of women in tax policy making are all things that we don't have right now. So definitely we will be watching the progress of this proposal with a lot of interest. Now on to Ian. Ian, my question for you is that aggressive tax planning practices unjustly deny governments the resources necessary to support women's rights. And governments have been taking tax transparency measures to tackle tax avoidance and tax evasion, and in some cases are cracking down on tax havens. But there's a lot of distance to go. So I'm hoping that you could please share some examples of some other measures that governments can take.
Thank you so much, Nana Ama, and to the organizers at the Global Alliance for Tax Justice for having FACT Coalition as part of this important discussion. And we're proud members of the Global Alliance for Tax Justice. For those of you who are not familiar with FACT, FACT is a US-based coalition of more than 100 organizations ranging from faith groups, international development, human rights labor environment, and we focus both on addressing the US role in facilitating global corruption as well as tax justice issues. I think we haven't talked a lot about tax transparency in this conversation so far, and we're also struggling with a lack of data about the problems. You know, a lot of estimates about how much tax dodging is costing both developed and developing countries alike, but very little hard information. And what information does exist is often kept privately held by tax authorities in developed countries. So over the past few years, there's been a big movement to increase the availability of public country-by-country reporting of taxes paid by multinational companies, as well as key economic indicators like number of employees per country, profits, turnovers, et cetera. And we're seeing important progress being made in tax transparency in a number of different ways. In the US, the FACT Coalition has been advocating for a new law, the Disclosure of Tax Havens and Offshoring Act, which would require public country-by-country reporting. We saw that pass our House of Representatives last summer, and we're working with Senate champions to get movement there. We've also seen in the European Union some progress with the first jurisdiction to actually put in place a form of, albeit limited, country-by-country public reporting. And so that's something to build on. And then we've seen, in terms of corporate action and the Global Reporting Initiative, a new tax reporting standard, large multinational companies like Vodafone, Shell, and other companies publishing their public country-by-country reports. And I think it's important to note that not only is civil society demanding this information, but investors are demanding this information. In an environment of potentially paradigm shifting changes in the ways that multinational companies are being taxed, investors are basically flying blind. They don't have information on the tax risks that those companies are facing. They don't have information on the tax planning strategies that these companies are using. And so we've seen greater investment and greater investor interest in tax transparency. I think something very exciting to note in the last few months is that investors have filed a shareholder proposal with Amazon. And that proposal has now attracted trillions of dollars in terms of assets under management and support. And so we hope to see that investor proposal is brought to Amazon's general meeting in May. This kind of public country-by-country reporting is also crucial for tax authorities in developing countries to be able to access this information. As some of you may know, public country-by-country reporting is quite limited now. The country-by-country reporting that is done is shared amongst mostly developed country tax authorities and not with many developing country tax authorities. So we think it's hugely important and has multiple benefits. I think in the interest of time, I would just note that in terms of tax evasion, it's important to note that the US, as our Treasury Secretary said last December, is probably the best place to hide and launder illicit funds. And so at the FACT Coalition, we're using the opportunity that has been presented by the Biden administration's first ever strategy to counter corruption, as well as the renewed attention on how oligarchs from Russia and around the world are able to stash their money in Western rule of law systems. I think Jayati rightly noted that if we can do it for Russian oligarchs, we can do it for oligarchs around the world, and we need to take a systematic approach to dealing with these problems. In the US, we're seeing great progress with our Corporate Transparency Act being implemented, setting up a beneficial ownership database for the first time. We also have new progress on addressing money laundering through real estate in the US, as we saw with the Pandora Papers. Elites, oligarchs, politically exposed persons from around the world are using our real estate system to dodge taxes at home and to drain wealth from developed and developing countries around the world. We also want to see progress being made on the enablers that Jayati also talked about, the accountants, the lawyers, the company formation agents, all those professional enablers who help oligarchs and other actors stash their money in the US using anonymous shell companies. And so these are the kinds of steps that I think are really important to take so that the governments around the world, including our own here, have sufficient resources so that they are able to progressively address their obligations to deal with gender justice. And I think one final thing I'd want to note is that since we had this kind of conversation last year for the Global Alliance for Tax Justice and the Global Days of Action on Gender Justice and Tax, FACT has now put in place our first ever diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy as a coalition. So we see it as an increasingly essential part of our coalition's work to connect the anti-corruption and tax justice agendas with issues related to gender inequality, racial inequality, and economic inequality. So we're really excited by this discussion and excited by the kinds of questions that have been raised today. So I'll hand it back over to you, Nana.
Ian, thank you so much for that overview, especially your mention about how very powerful investors are demanding this corporate information. It's an issue that I've covered in my own work at Tax Notes, and I think it is having and will continue to have ripple effects on transparency that will benefit everyone. So definitely an exciting time and an exciting space to be in. Now, we only have 5 minutes left for our program. I will throw out one follow-up question to our panel, and anyone who is interested in responding may respond to this. But we've talked a lot about what needs to be done and where governments and institutions need to do some more work. But I'm wondering if any of our panelists have any examples of countries that have adopted positive tax and fiscal policies from a feminist lens. Tove, would you like to weigh in?
Well, I think just so it doesn't become too depressing that we don't have a single example of a government. No, of course we do. Of course we do. I mean, I myself am Scandinavian and happy to have at least through my childhood and youth seen some very progressive tax systems. So the gender aspects are very linked to the issues of progressive taxes. And of course, there are still a number of governments that pursue progressive tax systems in one way or the other. Also on transparency, we have governments that try and introduce different types of transparency. It's also interesting to watch the discussion about the global tax system because, of course, the OECD rules say that countries shouldn't use digital services taxes. But the question is right now, when countries are in the middle of the COVID-induced crisis, whether they should really give up a tool like digital services taxes, which, yes, it has a lot of shortcomings, but the good thing about it is that it actually produces revenue relatively fast. And it produces revenue from some of the big corporations that are paying so little tax at the moment. So there are numerous examples of different types of transparency policies and progressive taxes. The one thing that brings us all together, I think, is that all those governments that are trying to pursue progressive taxes, they sooner or later hit a wall because of the failure of the global tax rules. If you try to introduce wealth tax, like we've seen the discussion in Argentina, you run into the problem that international tax dodging is still way too easy for the wealthy elites. Hiding your money is way too easy. And because we don't have an effective global system to make sure that governments can find that hidden wealth, then the progressive taxes can only be so progressive before they run into problems. Same with taxing multinational corporations. We have so many examples of governments that have tried, but it's so difficult to use the transfer pricing system to really introduce fair taxation of multinational corporations. So many, many good examples, and also many governments that really want to set a different agenda and fix these problems. The one thing we don't have is a coalition of truly progressive governments that actually set the agenda. And that's one thing that we're hoping to see, one that spans across North and South, basically bringing all the governments that are currently losing out together into a progressive tax agenda. So lots of good initiatives, but until the good governments or governments with good intentions and policies, until they learn to work together, they will also still be running after the bus, unfortunately.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tove. And really important point about how an international coalition is really necessary to advance this work forward. Now, I have to extend my warm thanks to all of our panelists and our keynote speaker. I mean, we had such a fantastic discussion today and really great answers to some very complicated questions. So now we're about to close today's event. But before we do so, I'm going to briefly hand over the floor to Caroline, who will share some closing remarks with us.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Nana. As we close today's session, I wanted to share with us some of the ways that you can be able to support the campaign that I talked about at the beginning, and also how you can be able to get involved with the campaign. So we still have 2 more global events that will be happening over the 2-week period. The next global event will be our CSW parallel event. It will take place on the 21st of March at 5 p.m. East Africa time, similar time to this particular event. So please do join us for that CSW event. We also have another event that will be taking place on the 23rd of March, but 2 hours earlier at 3 p.m. East Africa time. This event is being co-organized by the Global Alliance and colleagues within the Tax and Education Alliance. This Tax and Education Alliance brings together different organizations, including ActionAid, as well as Tax Justice Network. We have Education International, as well as the Global Coalition on Education. So please find time and do join us for these global events. But also you can make some noise on social media, share our messages on your Twitter handle, on your Facebook handle, use the hashtag Make Taxes Work for Women. And also in relation to social media, we will be having a Twitter chat on the 24th of March. Please do join us and let us make some noise together on Twitter. It would be great to have this particular campaign hashtag probably trend on that day. So please do join in. We have a pack of campaign materials that have been developed. There's the concept note for this campaign. There's a fact sheet that has been drafted. There are visuals that we have put out there, as well as infographic materials. We are also hoping that you could do a photo petition. There's a placard template that is available. We welcome you to take a photo and post it on your social media handle. You can take a photo of your friend or yourself or a group of you in your office or at home. And please do share these messages and remember to tag the Global Alliance for Tax Justice. Now, these are just some of the ways that you can be able to get involved and to support the campaign. We welcome you to also be innovative and creative, come up with other activities, and remember to share those with us, and we will be able to circulate and promote them on our different platforms. So please, we welcome you. Let us join in the campaign and keep pushing for the demands that I also mentioned at the beginning. So thank you so much for taking time to join this session. We really hope that we are going to continue having this conversation and to ensure that our demands are really achieved in the near future. So I hand it back to you, Nana, to close the session.
All right, wonderful. Caroline, thank you so much. And Lais, thank you so much also for adding all of the links to all the relevant materials in the chat. So again, thank you to everyone for participating, for tuning in. And I hope that you all leave this conversation feeling very inspired and with some knowledge as to what we can do to move forward.
And from my handout, thank you very much, Nana, for moderating.
Thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure.
Every year.
Great job.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you so much.